Hello, it is Thursday, 2nd of July 2026. Welcome to Powerlines. My name is Ben Beattie. Powerlines focuses on the Australian energy sector and challenges the popular narrative. Regular host Chris Yulman has flown north to escape the miserable Canberra cold and will be back in a few weeks. I'm holding down the fort from the much milder climate of Brisbane. Our guest today is Jane Norman, Managing Director and Chief Executive Officer of Amplitude Energy, and Jane is a chemical engineer with over 30 years' experience in the energy sector globally and here in Australia. Amplitude is an oil and gas producer in Victoria and Bass Strait, which makes Jane well placed to discuss the Victorian gas situation. There has been little in the mainstream media about getting more oil and gas out of the Gippsland and Otway basins, and today we'll present some facts, discuss the ongoing shutdown of Longford, what that might mean for energy security in Victoria and, further afield for Australian gas consumers. Hello, Jane, and welcome.
Great. Thanks, Ben. Appreciate the invitation.
Excellent. Well, I saw you, Chris had you on Sky News when he was filling in for Chris Kenny. And you had a really good chat then and made a lot of sense. So I thought it'd be fantastic to get you in a little bit less formal situation and have a chat about the whole thing.
Sounds good.
One of my most, one of the quirks of the oil and gas industry is something that most people might not realise, but do you speak in barrels, tons, or TJs, or are you fluent in all three?
A mix of those, Ben, but in Victoria, where we're mainly producing gas, we speak in petajoules and terajoules a day.
Yes, and I'm also used to the gigajoules and the terajoules, less so the petajoules because I'm at a lower part of the gas sector. I'm a mere engineer working on day-to-day things, not the strategies. What's your perspective on the gas situation on a more serious topic?
In terms of the reservation the government's proposing now?
That'd be a fine place to start, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so just to clarify for listeners, what's being proposed through a draft policy is 20% of all export volumes across Australia would come back into the domestic market as an obligation, and the way it's been drafted, it would be retrospective, not prospective, so it would apply to existing contracts, and there's an obligation to supply that gas, not just offer it to the market on commercial terms. So you'd be forced to sell at any price to get your 20% commitment away. There's also, one of the issues we have with it is it drives a lot of short-termism into the market. It has a 12-month export license that has to be renewed every year by demonstrating your commitment to the domestic market. And that short-termism is the absolute opposite of what domestic gas producers like us need. We need foundation contracts from customers who buy 5+ years of gas through offtake agreements that can underpin investment decisions and FID processes.
Yeah, that's a whole list of concerns. The opening one you pointed out there, the obligation to supply it, even if if people don't want it, that would be kind of difficult if the market isn't there, if no one wants it, say if it's a low demand period.
Absolutely right. And I think, the central question here is there a supply problem, yes or no? The market is balanced at the moment, and the forecast from AEMO in their gas statement of opportunities suggests the market remains balanced, except for maybe the odd peak day in Victoria. We have very strong seasonal demand for gas. So I think you've got to start with that question. Is there a problem, yes or no? And then if there is a problem, how do you solve that in a way that doesn't have very detrimental financial impact on the domestic gas producers? Because today 70% of East Coast gas for domestic customers is provided by companies like ours who have focused on domestic-only production. So you don't want to hurt those investments, and you really want to encourage the exporters to contribute to that market in a way that's commercial for them to do so. And so, we point to the example of the WA domestic market obligation that's been in place for a number of years now. And in many ways, that's a superior policy because it's prospective. So you know what you're obliged to do before you enter your investment decision. It's shaped over the life of the asset. So it's not an obligation to put a certain amount of gas in or percentage of the reserves every year. It can be shaped at the front or back end. And also, it has a commerciality test, so you don't have to put that gas into the domestic market unless it is commercial to do so. i.e. you're making a return on your invested capital when you put that into the domestic market, not just your LNG exports. So, those three factors, we'd want to see those replicated in anything that's applied nationally. But ultimately, we need to make sure that the market remains attractive from a price point of view for that 70% of gas that comes in from players like us to support future investment decisions.
Yeah, that's the interesting that where you mentioned that the reserve applies to existing contracts and not just new contracts. I'm going to pull up a clip of David Pocock. I'm not sure what your opinions are of Mr. Pocock, Jane, but I will hold back as well. It's some of the things that come out of I would frame it as an anti-gas activist sort of framework. And we're talking sort of the Australia Institute. We've got some other stuff with Punter, maybe Conrad Benjamin to talk about later. But a short clip of Mr. Pocock on the ABC News recently talking about gas taxes. If I can make it play.
Why do you think the idea of a 25% tax on gas export has attracted such a wide spectrum of supporters?
Because Australians know that we're getting absolutely fleeced when it comes to our gas exports. We're not getting a fair return. We're one of the biggest gas exporters in the world. And yet we feel poor every time gas prices go up internationally. And then we look at Norway and they've got a $3 trillion sovereign wealth fund. Australians know that this just comes down to political leadership, political courage to actually put Australians ahead of the gas company. And as you said in the intro, this is not a left versus right issue. You've got Clive Palmer and the Greens saying a 25% gas export tax is the way to go now. The problem is we've got the gas industry, vested interests, with a stranglehold on the major parties at the moment. And we need them to put Australians ahead of the gas industry.
So, Jane, Dave Pocock there is conflating multiple issues in one kind of claim against the gas lobby. I would say the Norway comparison, he's talking about total gas when in fact the east coast of Australia has got nothing to do with the west coast of Australia or even the Northern Territory gas, or largely even some of the Victorian gas, because most of that's consumed domestically and not going over to exports. What kind of response can we give to David Pocock to maybe lighten him up a bit?
Yeah, look, there's a mashup of a lot of issues there, right? And conflating a lot of issues as well. So Australia is blessed with significant gas resources that dwarf the domestic need. And that is how our export industries have grown, because Australian companies and foreign investors, quite often the Asian LNG customers, have come into the market to help get these projects up. And each of the Gladstone projects, the 3 projects that export in Gladstone, their demand for gas, their feed gas, is equivalent to the domestic gas demand on the East Coast. So it's effectively 3 times what the domestic economy uses. And that's what's allowed us to get these big export projects up. I think what we've seen in certainly at the East Coast is the lack of support, in particular from the Victorian and New South Wales governments, for new supply. And that's actually created the problem. It's not Queensland's awash with gas, both domestic and export, but it's the southern states not supporting new gas development that's created the problem. And the reference he makes to Norway's sovereign wealth fund, and that's because they have a national oil company, as other countries do, that creates government income from investment in projects. I mean, maybe he's going to vote for Pauline Hanson at the next election because that's her policy, to create a government investment in oil and gas up to 30% in new projects. And then the profits from that will be invested into a sovereign wealth fund for the country, which is quite a different model to the model we have here.
And not something that would be easy to retrospectively apply either.
No, it would have to be prospective. So it would apply to new developments. And we know that the Australian Institute and Punter's Politics have really confused the issue around how much tax the sector pays. And they've compared the tax the beer industry pays with the PRRT tax. Now, petroleum resource rent tax only applies to offshore projects, and they're allowed to deduct their invested capital before they start paying that tax. But that's just one bucket of tax that the upstream industry pays. The dominant tax is corporate tax, and then there's also state royalties. So if you compare corporate tax, PRT, and state royalties with the tax the beer industry pays, it dwarfs that beer industry tax. So they're selectively picking up facts here to compare in a favourable way. It is an anti-gas narrative, it's an anti-fossil fuel narrative, but it's just not looking at the reality of that energy mix. Because if we look at what's made out of gas in our country from a manufacturing perspective, which accounts for around 40% of gas, it's bricks, glass, paper, pipes, everything that's the fertilizer, it's everything that's the backbone of the food security and the backbone of the construction sector. And if we don't make those products here, then you just end up importing them from other countries. And that if you're worried about emissions, that's a worse outcome on emissions, because you've now added freight emissions to bring those products in from, say, Indonesia. So, it's got to be realistic. And what we're seeing now, especially with the focus on energy security following the Iran conflict, it's about the energy addition. It's about energy meeting the growing needs, data center demand, that race for data centers. That's going to happen with reliable, affordable energy. And the one thing that hasn't been discussed by the Labor government right now with this reservation policy, but certainly not by David Pocock, is how do we increase the supply of gas to get the cost of gas down? Because the countries that have low gas, it's because they have encouraged and welcomed investment in both oil and gas, and then they get a lot of associated gas with those liquids in places like the Permian Basin in the US. So, we need to focus on how do we encourage that investment. If we can get gas to market at an affordable enough price, then you will actually see that coal to gas switching that would significantly reduce Australia's emissions. We would have met our 2030 target entirely had we switched from coal to gas.
Indeed. And Jane, you mentioned the wish for possibly using more gas. I would argue that David Pocock and his fellow travellers, their ultimate aim is to shut down the gas industry entirely. When I showed the previous clip of David Pocock, we started talking about a domestic reserve, and then he was talking about the gas. In my mind, they're very closely linked. But when we're talking about the domestic reserve, that's not going to apply to anything in Victoria, is it?
Not necessarily, but it's not super clear in the draft legislation. The draft policy at the moment.
So we're not entirely sure at the moment. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. So, in theory, 80% of any new project or any exported gas has to make a 20% contribution. So potentially you see a new project get up, and then that gas has to contribute 20% of the supply into the domestic market. So it doesn't make sense to move gas from Victoria to Queensland, given Queensland has a lot of gas and Victoria's got the problem. There's $4 of transportation costs between the Wallumbilla hub and the Victorian market as well. And what we know is that the lowest cost, lowest emission gas is the gas closest to the market, which is why, we think it makes sense to keep investing in those offshore basins in Victoria to get gas through the existing infrastructure.
Yeah, 100%. I've just got a quick image here for the viewers I'll pull up, which is the from I think one of the government agencies, which shows some of the Gippsland Basin I mentioned earlier and the Otway Basin as well. Jane, what's your thoughts on how much more gas and even oil, I guess, could come out of these regions?
Yeah, look, I think what you have here is a map of some of the onshore positions as well, but offshore in the Otway, Gippsland and Bass Basins, you've got over 2,000 petajoules of discovered gas, so reserves and resources. So that number doesn't include any of the exploration targets we call prospective resources. And 2,000 petajoules of discovered gas, that's years of gas for the Victorian market. And so really it's about how do you encourage that investment and how do you support fast approvals through streamlining approvals and also encouraging and welcoming that international investment.
Yeah, indeed. Another point to make, I wanted to talk about you mentioned the transport costs of the pipelines. Now, I have a map coming up now, which is the major pipelines, and you can see here the Surat Basin in Queensland, which then pushes gas up to Gladstone, and you mentioned the Wallumbilla pipeline over here in Western Queensland. Getting gas from Queensland all the way to Victoria, that's a costly activity, right?
That is right. So there's one pipeline connection today that connects that Queensland market back into the southeast market, and that's that APA Southwest Queensland pipeline that goes back to Moomba, which is in the centre of your map in the Cooper Basin, and then from there they can get into that spoke, either into the Moomba to Sydney market or Moomba to Adelaide, and then from there you come round through Eastern Gas Pipeline, which is the Gemina pipeline we put gas into from our Orbis plant, or you come back down the Sea Gas Pipeline, which connects Victoria and South Australia, and that's the pipeline we use to send gas from our Athena plant across to Adelaide, in particular to Angie at Pelican Point. It's a big power station there. And that's around $4 of transport if you just add up the tariffs on those lines. The pipeline is limited today to around 450 terajoules a day. APA have plans to expand that capacity to high 600s. That's going to take a few years to do that. It's by adding compression to the pipeline. But ultimately it limits what can come down to Victoria, and it limits what's available on peak days. We have one commercial storage facility in Victoria, which is Lockard's Iona facility. It's actually right next to our Athena gas plant in the Otway, and that has significant withdrawal capacity to meet peak demand into Victoria. But there's no other commercial storage. There are other projects being proposed, such as the Golden Beach project, but I think that's one of the big issues that AEMO raised in its latest integrated system plan, is that the requirement for gas in power gen is going to become peakier. So as gas-fired power is required to shape around renewables, as we've literally seen last week in South Australia, where you had gas running for nearly 5 days at about 80-85% of the power mix, and then not required when the wind picks back up, you've got to have not only the gas turbines that can turn up and down, but you've got to have the gas delivery, the upstream deliverability from the fields or from storage to meet that demand.
Yeah,
and
it's
so
like a gas turbine doesn't run on its own, right? There's not hamsters spinning around in those things.
Yeah, and look, our biggest customers today are AGL and Energy Australia and Engie, and if you speak to those gentailers, they want diversity of supply, they want diversity of delivery point. It helps manage risk for them. They don't want to rely on one pipeline down from Queensland delivering their gas. So we expect that demand for southern gas delivered in southern markets to continue. But what we have seen in Queensland is this development of a fantastic export industry with LNG, and on the back of that, a fantastic domestic gas industry, and that's encouraged investment in all sorts of industrial activity in Queensland. And we just want to see southern states replicate that economic revolution for their states, really.
That'd be very nice. I've got to switch tacks now to something where Conrad Benjamin, aka Punters Politics, he has a certain notoriety on the.
But they don't have gas running yet, and so the comparisons the comparisons that we have about this all being about tax not coming into Australia is not true.
Why do we have gas going out of the country and then being sold back to us?
Well, we don't.
We do.
Gas, we can't import gas. We have no facility that allows for gas to come into Australia.
How are we shipping it
Zero,
out?
none.
What's leaving Gladstone there?
So what happens in Australia?
I clicked the button a bit too early, but I think we get the message. So to start this little section off, I feel a little bit sorry for Conrad, in the sense he's quite a talented dude. He's good on camera, and he can make all his these little role-playing things. That's all great, and it's good fun to watch. What does concern me is if he's tied himself very closely to the fortunes and the I guess the public perception of information from the Australia Institute. Now, they can weather the storm. They've got wealthy donors, etc., including some people who may or may not be building LNG import terminals. That's a whole different topic. But I do feel sorry for him. So what happens with Punter when people realise that he doesn't know what he's talking about? Clearly there, where he's genuinely exasperated that Susan McDonald is denying that we import gas. Where does he go? Where do we go from here?
I don't know. I don't know what he's talking about, other than he's conflating the Port Kembla project and other proposed projects as already being operational. We don't import LNG today. And in fact, what we have seen is those LNG projects have been big contributors into the domestic gas market. And whether that's at Gladstone or whether that's Impex's plant in Darwin, which supplies domestic gas into that Darwin market, our economies have benefited from those export projects, both in terms of revenue and royalties and tax take, but also in physical gas contribution. I think the risk of importing LNG means you add to the energy security issues we already have in liquids. We have 2 refineries left. We import about 80% of our crude, 85% of our crude, and refined products. And why would you want to replicate that in gas when we are such a gas-rich country? And LNG exports today, the Asian market, which is directly north of us, 50-cent transport distance directly north of us, is the dominant LNG market. It's 70% of global LNG demand sitting in that market. So Australia is so well placed to service that market. If we had LNG imports into Port Kembla or one of the plants regas plants that's being proposed in Victoria, over the last few months, we would have had gas prices at $35 a gigajoule. Our average contract price at the moment sits just above $10 a gigajoule. So you're talking more than 3 times the price that they currently are buying gas at.
So kind of like 2022 prices, right?
Yeah, you're exposing all the Australian users to those prices. But look at the impact of the Straits of Hormuz closure and global LNG. That travels through 3 main sea lanes: Straits of Malacca, South China Sea, and Straits of Hormuz. And if we ended up with conflicts in 2 or 3 of those areas, you would see the LNG trade shut down. So why would you want to become reliant on physical delivery of LNG from other countries when you are such?
This is mirroring the situation. You mentioned South Australia. So at times when the wind and the sun is plentiful, they can basically say, yep, we're all good. But as soon as that wind and the sun disappears, they're very exposed to peak pricing and even more in the future. You mentioned the integrated system plan and the gas statement of opportunities, where AEMO is talking about the risk of gas powered generation having very, very little, or then all of it all at once, and the necessary upstream of that, the infrastructure necessary to deliver that is significant. And the utilization, if it's underutilized and sitting there doing nothing for 11 months of the year, the per unit cost is going to be very, very high.
Yeah, absolutely. And that was a big takeaway from last week's integrated system plan from AEMO, is they're forecasting a significant increase in gas-fired power generation demand as coal retires and as more intermittent renewables come into the mix. And so they even pointed out the inconsistency in requiring that, but also having no incentives to actually deliver it. And so there is no federal government scheme that includes gas or funding for gas-fired power generation. It's not allowed to be in any of the capacity investment schemes. Some state governments are trying to set something up. The South Australian government is, New South Wales government is looking at something, because they know with those very low utilisation rates, but on the days it's needed, it's essential to balance the market, that you've got to incentivise it. And the WA market, which is obviously disconnected from the rest of the NEM, that has a spinning reserve to pay gas providers to be on standby for GPG, gas power generation.
Which is an ongoing continuous overhead on top of the actual consumption.
That's right. And so what we want to see is that sort of investment signal on the East Coast so that the investment decisions are made in time. If you made a decision today that you were going to install gas-fired power gen, it probably wouldn't be available for 3 years because of the permitting, the actual equipment, and 3 years would be getting a reciprocating engine. If you wanted turbines, it's probably more like 5 years. So there's a global rush for this equipment, driven by concerns about energy security, new data center demand, pushing up electricity demand. So we'd love to see a federal scheme that includes gas in the capacity mechanism, but also really encourage those state governments to implement what they're proposing.
Jane, can a higher demand for gas reduce the overall cost of it per unit to consumers?
Yes, I mean, globally we've seen that the only thing that brings down the cost of gas sustainably is more supply and creating a more competitive market. And, if I give you the example of our Otway Basin project today, we are in a rig consortium, so a consortium to bring the Transocean Equinox semi-submersible rig to the region with Woodside, Beach Energy and Conoco. And by forming those kind of rig clubs, we can share the mobilisation demob cost, and the other services are all an integrated spread that we all hire. And so that's the kind of thing that if you have scale, you can get those cost savings and cost benefits. But, we want to see activity increase to bring supply to market and bring costs down. And we'd love to see some streamlining of approvals and for the government to really tackle the cost of gas supply, because ultimately our costs just get all translated into the ultimate cost of gas.
Yeah, 100%. And you mentioned the retirement, or AEMO's forecasting retirement of coal-fired generators. My personal opinion is it's going to be a lot longer than they think it is. What's the consensus? Is there a consensus around the C-suite where you hang out with? Do the ladies and gentlemen talk about this stuff in your area?
Yeah, look, I think most people think it's going to be a lot longer. In fact, I think the main concern is it's going to fall apart before it gets retired, because the governments keep asking the gentailers to extend the supply by another 2 to 3 years. But a lot of this equipment needs a big refurbishment to keep it going for 10 or 20 years. And in particular in the Latrobe Valley, the old brown coal units, they're reliant on that brown coal resource being available. And if that's not being developed, then that coal facility can't afford to import that poor quality coal into the region and be economically viable.
Yeah, it's all very scary. Jane, we could talk about this like literally a lot longer. I'd love to go into a lot more detail with you, especially about the pipeline bottlenecks and why a reserve on the East Coast in Queensland won't actually help Victoria. But you've limited me to 30 minutes, which I'm very grateful for. So thank you very much for coming on.
Great. Thanks, Ben. Pleasure.